you, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm excited to be able to spend a few minutes with you here today and to be able to talk about this campaign and the activity and what we know about it, share the information that we've been able and tell the story of how everything took place. Again, my name is Jonathan Homer. I am the chief of the Systems Group. And let me explain a little bit about who we are and what we do to provide some context of why we had a role in this campaign throughout the efforts of the entire federal government. Within the 100% here at the end, we'll to respond to both retroactively and proactively threats against the cyber grid, several key components, and that would be these. We work with, and by asset owners, the federal agencies, but we also work with the critical infrastructure of the nation as defined by the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. We work with the state, local, tribal, and territorial groups, and then we work with academia as well. And in that role, we have the opportunity to be hands-on, boots on the ground, investigating many of the significant cyber threats as they providing advanced technical support. And the group for which I'm in charge is specifically focused on the industrial control system. For those that aren't familiar with ICS, this is really the non-traditional computers. These are the power grids and the water pumps, those types of manufacturing lines, etc. Those types of computing equipment that is the whole campaign, and how does it work forward from here? Next slide, if we could. First of all, understanding that this is a advanced persistent threat, classic definition. Looking at an organization that got in and stuck around, we're looking at some advanced tactics in this effort in this area. There are hundreds of victims that were either targeted or affected within this group. It was a focus area on the energy sector, and specifically within energy, we're talking about generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. But there were also victims, and you'll see them on a slide coming up, in the nuclear sector, in the aviation sector, critical manufacturing, government entities, those victims being targeted or affected. The response effort and the understanding of the full picture coordinated for the rest of the government, not just DHS. This is an example of where the federal government came together, worked with one another, also worked with a number of industry organizations in a effort that was tied together at a both technical as well as strategic level to be able to understand the bigger picture and the appropriate response. The punchline, if you do, but they haven't actually caused any physical. We'll go into details on what that means. Next slide. Tell this story. The graphic that you see on your screen is a bullseye, and think of it like this. Let me explain what it is, and then it will quick work. That is the objective of the ultimate organizations and networks to do. And then as we progressively move out on the concentric circles and we look towards the outside, understanding these are organizations that are less directly connected, or better way, they are less valuable, but they have relationships that tie in with these organizations. And so we begin the story in early 2016, truly remains completely on the side, unconnected to anything. Okay, next slide. In early 2017, a vendor, which is not related in any business way to the other, also becomes spearfished, and when they begin, this vendor is then used. Next slide. This vendor is then used to initiate phishing attacks against two other organizations. One being a provided vendor that they do business with, and then the other one being a government organization. Government organization is pretty ancillary, doesn't have a big role in this, but they did reach out and send those phishing emails. The vendor that you see did ship 2-3. This is not an organization. This effort. Next slide. This third vendor then conducts some test emails. The infrastructure, the Microsoft Exchange environments began to communicate, compromise between them. Again, a pre-existing relationship. The infrastructure wouldn't normally be talking in their normal configuration, and there's able to facilitate malicious activity flowing between them. Next slide. Vendor number 4 is then used to conduct phishing tests against a number of organizations, including some utility organizations, an energy company, a nuclear company. You'll get tired of me saying that phrase, but they get tired. But they have pre-existing relationships with the vendor. They work with them. They know about them. They have contracts or some sort with this organization. And so this is a very trusted source to which the organizations tend to let through their cyber defenses more easily, or relax the rules, so to speak. Next slide. We go back and we see the threat actor, not back in time, forward in time, but back in talking about vendor number 3, and we start seeing that phishing has occurred, and now using the infrastructure of vendor number 3. So reconnaissance, basically going out and visiting their public-facing website, looking to see what files or images or other things are exposed, occurs against the same targets, but from if you're a defender, one of the things you would notice here, if you're looking deep enough into your logs, is that you have two different vendors who are very exposed. It takes some pretty deep analysis and and understanding of the environment to be able to detect it. Next slide. We then see the initial compromise has on the right-hand side for over a year come back alive and begin to start having some activity. And we see that access, or in other words, malicious channels begin coming in, and there's two-way communication again that been reached out to. And those organizations have a pre-existing relationship with them. They're silent in the background for quite some time. That vendor then begins to work and pivot through, etc. And let's go to the next slide if we can. And then we see vendor number 3 come back into play once more, and we see access being gained from their visualization, and we understand all of the tactics and techniques that are being used in the artifacts collected. We start to understand more about this picture and understand what lines of the campaign really looks to be. Next slide. Talking about who was targeted, and this is referring to the dots that you just saw on that bullseye. And I'll explain one thing for victims who were targeted for compromise. Dots saw the most creative cyber attack purposes. So who are these targets? As we get close to the center, starting at the end, who is compromised, small, medium, and large organizations, small, just a few are just being significant. So it really didn't, there was not a determining factor based upon its value of the strategic placement appears to be more critical there. The U.S. targets were focused within the energy sector, as I said. We're looking at the power generation, transmission, and distribution component. And those intended targets do have good sophistication. They have the right tools, they have the budgets, they have the capabilities to defend their networks in this effort. At this point, the threat actor is counting. Staging targets have those pre-existing relations, naturally a sense of trust, whether it's warranted or not, a sense of trust between the organizations. So now, who are the outer rings, what we're calling staging targets? They are smaller organizations. They have less gated networks. They're out there. They're the providers, the vendors, integrators, the strategic R&D partners, all of these types of organizations, and they were selected because of their pre-existing relationship with the intended target. This is not a targets of opportunity type of campaign. This is not one where the threat actor went around and said, who forgot to patch their systems last month and take advantage of this vulnerability. This is a situation where they went in and they said, this is the organization we're looking for because of their connections, because of the relationship they have with the intent, and found the weaknesses. They use these staging targets, as well as their capability to leverage their networks to be able to pivot through, so that the intended targets, when it appeared to the intended target as if the traffic or the code was originating from the staging target or one of their trusted partners. Next slide. So with the summary of the timeline in place, let me explain what I'd like to cover for the next few. That I do a comprehensive overview of all of the aspects of the attack. It would take hours to go through, and that is contained within the alert that TA 18074 alert. That alert goes through and lists all the indicators of compromise, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are out there. There are also a number of third parties available. An excellent job at understanding and depicting what the attack actually looked like in great detail, and I encourage you to take a look at the things that are different than we see in a traditional cyber attack. Be able to go through and understand all of that kind of area. Two different things. I'm going to start off by talking about the corporate networks. How did they get into the corporate networks? How did they move around? What did they look for, etc. And then we'll move on and talk about the control systems, what they targeted, how they moved from there. Next slide. Regarding the corporate networks, the very first stage of reconnaissance, they accessed the corporate websites of the staging targets. They went through, and it appears to be clear that the activity was human-driven, that there was a human on the other side clicking and downloading and doing, not one where a script was released and they scraped down all the data or something. Numerous artifacts help us to understand humans back there crunching through this and understanding the data. The list of targets appear to align to open source lists. We've all attended, whether it be a conference or meeting where the third party has published our involvement, or organization that publishes our membership, either as an individual and organizational level. If we compare the list of victims to known open source lists, we see the correlation. Those things that are published were part of the picture and how this reconnaissance took place. Also, the downloading of the detailed photos. There's a number of organizations. Let me say differently. When web designers put out a web page, they had the option to upload very detailed images, and they don't have to use those in what's called full resolution. They may shrink them down by in or out. And for those that are not technically savvy that are on the line with me today, think of it this way. When you take a picture with your cell phone and then you zoom in by pinching or zooming, you can zoom in quite a bit on a picture and it still is very clear to be able to read. Well, in the same kind of concept, they're out there, and there are some pictures that have been posted by the organizations to their public web pages. And these are things like PR events or other events where the focus of the picture is in the foreground, a groundbreaking ceremony or cutting a ribbon or something like that. And there's the CEO talking to the mayor or some scenario. And that's what the focus is on. But in the background of the picture are control systems. And on these control systems, things like set points and safety guards. Is very valuable information, but it's in the background, and the organization didn't realize it was published. Well, the threat actors go onto the websites, they download these images, and the images that they download are the ones that start that effort. Next slide. So how do they actually get in? Two different things. One is talking about spear phishing. One is watering hole, and the actual mechanisms that they get in. And it all revolves around something called server message block, or SMB. Most that are standard SMB. It is the mechanism by which Windows primarily performs authentication. And I'm going to simplify this a little bit, but to make sure everyone gets it, and be able to exchange information to ensure that they trust each other and that the server or that the other end. Okay, keep that in the back of your mind. Let's talk about spear phishing for just a minute. Spear phishing, as we're all used to it, is the act of being able to send an email that is highly crafted to be open and something just happens on the computer. Now, two distinct types of spear phishing that we're used to in the industry. One is where the attachment contains and where you find activity on the machine, the code runs locally, and the machine is compromised. And you defeat this, or at least attempt to counter it, by some very advanced host-based tools, your antivirus and prevention, a number of other mechanisms that are available to be able to detect malware in the attachment. In this particular case, is provided. And so you might have an attachment that has a link in it, or just the email itself has a link. Deception is convinced to click on the link that opens a internet browser, and then through the internet browser, either credentials or harvest. They ask the user to produce, or they then at that point deliver some type of malware in place. Okay, neither one of those techniques is used. Instead, they do something slightly more creative. We're talking about Microsoft. Microsoft has seen an error dealing with the normal.m file. Okay, now this normal.m file is locally on the workend. It is designed to be there. It is the file that defines in simple terms, the template of the formatting of the document. And the computer has default it's local, but it is possible to specify a custom location to produce a different point that particular file's normal.m to a new location. Okay, so the threat actor goes in and they deliver a file by spear phishing, and they deliver it to the user, and the user opens the file, and the file has a local, but it's out on the internet at an HTTP URL type of connection. It's at a file : connection. This initiates an SMB connection because it reaches out to grab that file. And the way the exchange happens is this. The client, in this case Microsoft Word or equivalent, Microsoft Word on the machine server, and the server says, I don't know who you are, please authenticate. And this is a very normal thing. And so when that does, that sends that message back to the client, and the client says, I do this 100,000 times a day on my local network, and therefore I'm going to send what's called the hash, or the user hash. And the hash is an encrypted version of the username and password that is for the local machine. That is sent to the server. In this situation, the server then returns the file, and the transaction has been completed. It doesn't actually matter if the file is actually returned. That's not a critical part of this path, because at the point that the hash is sent to the threat actor, to the compromised server on the other end, that transfer of credentials has taken place. And so that's occurred without any malware, without the user's knowledge. There's likely no error on the screen when this translates place. Now, the watering hole is very, very simple. Instead of sending the user an attachment, this time they compromise the vendors, say their main web page or one of the subordinate pages in this effort. By doing so, the watering hole goes through and they create an iframe in the background. So basically the normal web page loads that would load with that vendor's website, but in the background an iframe loads, and the source of that iframe is a file : IP address / and then an image or data file. And the computer, the local client, does exactly the same thing. So the server says, hi, I need this file. The server says, I don't know who you are, please send me your creds. And the client sends the credentials out because that's the way it's designed. Now, this is not necessarily a fault of the architecture of how the computers are configured, the client-server relationship. This is a very intentional design designed to happen on the internal networks all day long. But it's not designed to be secured on the outside. So we'll talk about that as a mitigation here. Okay, so the tactic for credential harvesting, they're creating these SMB connections to send a hash. They're doing it by a spearfish attachment referencing a normal.m file, or they're doing it by watering hole with an iframe out remotely. Next slide. Once they have the credentials, because they have not infected the local machine, the threat actor does not at this point have any type of presence inside the network. They don't have a way to get back in. I'll have our usernames and passwords for the users which clicked on that email or opened that watering hole. They don't have a mechanism, a doorway to go back in, and so they're going to need to find a way to get into the network. In this campaign, they are primarily leveraging those credentials against externally facing single-factor authenticated systems. Well, what does that mean in English? Think about when you go home and you decide to work from home on the weekend or in an evening. You take your corporate laptop home, and you do something called VPN, or virtual private network. You create a VPN tunnel back into your corporate network, and you're able to access the same resources you were as if you were sitting in the office. This VPN technology is designed to be very friendly and enable business remotely, and it's been a backbone of corporate America for a long time. VPN, in these configurations, ideally VPN is going to require multi-factor authentication, and it's going to be very complex. But VPN can also be configured that has usernames and passwords. And so the threat actor does nothing more than go to vpn.corporate.com. They are now into the internal network, and it appears, for all intents and purposes, to the internal network that is just that employee logging in for information. They also use things like Outlook Web Access. That's a mechanism by which you can check your email while working remotely. Remote desktop connections. There were organizations that had their port 3389 forwarded on through the firewall to specific machines on the inside. Again, single-factor authentication. It prompts the threat actor for username and password, which they have. They put it in, and they're back. With that crunchy, hard outer shell firewall type of defenses is just by being able to leverage the authenticated systems that the corporations themselves put in place. Another comment at the slide is that many of the organizations, their primary VPN systems or their primary OWA systems required multi that a simple username and password couldn't in. However, they had ancillary systems that were stood up for other reasons. Might be that they were stood up for small subgroups, that there were, I have 30,000 customers that do it, I'll call it correctly or more thoroughly, but they have another 50 or 100 users that need a backdoor way in because their systems can't support, or contractually there's an obligation, or for whatever reason, they have to provide this alternative method in. And the configuration of the tools did not properly restrict this down mechanism, or that it was only limited to those users. And so the threat actor simply used the side door to get in with the captured credentials and walk. Okay, next slide. This is an interesting slide for me. I find many people interpret this slide incorrectly. I want you to see here. On the right-hand side are a list of tools. Now, these are fairly well-known, common tools that are used through the actor. I say, I'll go look and then learn from this slide. We did see these tools being used on occasion on some side systems, which they prefer not to use tools because these tools leave a footprint. And so we saw these tools used only when they couldn't accomplish their goals by using legitimate credentials and legitimate channels. So you might see, for example, Mimikatz, the top of the list. You might see Mimikatz, but the absence of Mimikatz should not be interpreted to say the threat actor was not present. As long as we understand that point, that's a key takeaway from this. Next slide. Now, the concept of persistence. You'd say the threat actor only has a username and password, and if you reset that password, you'd kick them out of the network. It talks about a very interesting and unique way in which the threat actor is able to maintain persistence. It works like this. All of us are familiar with a little arrow in the corner, and they are used to simplify the process by which you can access a document or access an application, or right folder information. Just a simple way to be able to get there. These shortcut files consist of two very important variables when you think about it. At the bottom of, when you look at the shortcut, at the bottom is a title. That's the words that appear underneath that, and that's the name of the shortcut. And then there's a picture that is part of the shortcut, the image or the icon that is above that title. Now, that image by default is an image that is default by file type and is applied to it automatically. Now, many of you have probably taken the opportunity or know that it's possible to change the icon associated with the shortcut. And change goes through, you right-click on it and go into Properties, and you say Change Icon, and it gives you a list of different images you can design. Back up one thing. We've seen shortcuts be manipulated before. We've seen other threat actors who have taken the shortcut and they have pointed the shortcut to a malicious location so that when the user double-clicked on the link file, then something malicious just occur. Then the file was accessed or loaded, etc. But in this case, the threat actor did something different. What they did is they went into the shortcut and they changed the image location to not be a local image file, but rather it pointed to a file : // IP address image, right? We saw is the shortcut is stored on the desktop. That's every user. When it would be displayed, password, and then the IT department would get, and then users would log back in, and they would pull up their desktop. And just by seeing the image of that shortcut, the initiation of that transfer and all of the credentials of the compromised machines go running back out to the threat actor, basically taking away any value that network reset or the password reset actually occurred. So a very unique way of persisting. We'll talk about how to defeat it here in just a minute, but understanding that SMB connection using link files was a huge TTP of this campaign. Next slide. So we've been talking about the corporate world. We've been talking about how did they get into the corporate network and what did they do there. Let me spend some time on the control systems and talk about where they got there and that. As I mentioned earlier, the threat actor was conducting activities and looking as looking for information that specifically related to control systems. They want to understand what are the vendors, what are the, say, interdependent, all of that kind of information by each specific victim. Control systems are unique. They're not like traditional IT computers where you buy a high-quality commodity and drop it in to be able to immediately have it go into play. Rather, control systems go through and they go and they're very unique. So you buy a piece of hardware that is very customized for the location and for the situation. And in that regard, in order for a threat actor, let's even back up, in order for a hired employee to effectively manage and administer a control system network, it takes them months of learning that particular configuration. And in the same regard, a threat actor who wishes to manipulate a control system has to understand that particular setup, architecture, and design. So they're trying to understand this information. Now, many of the phishing emails were also targeted against the control system operator. Options to play in that realm. Next slide. Once they gained access into the corporate network, before we even talk about getting in the control system itself, while they're on the file servers, they're on the Active Directory servers, etc., we see them going in and scouring that network for specific file names and specific keywords, things pertaining to vendor information and reference. They want those layouts of the ICS architecture and how the pieces connect and any configuration settings. They're scouring through the file systems to be able to find and store both locally and on network locations. One jump, and I'll highlight on this, the jump box, for those who aren't familiar with them, is just a computer that IT groups put in place that allow them to bottleneck wherever to pivot over into the control system. Only certain computers can. And then all the administrators on the corporate side have to go into the jump box, authenticate there, and then be able to jump into the ICS environment itself. It's the security measure that makes it more secure. Well, on those jump boxes, we found that a number of organizations had stored saved configurations for their destinations. In other words, when you use some of the different remote desktop softwares, you can save a that preloads all of the specific IP addresses, ports, default username, things like this, so that you just have to provide credentials and log in, but you don't have to specify the connections themselves. They've stored these settings within all of these files for all of the jump servers on the ICS side of the firewall. And so when the threat actor, using those captured credentials that they had been able to successfully gain, they downloaded all those configurations. And what did they gain from this? All of the necessary points by which they needed to target on the ICS house. And that admin jump box is a very interesting ICS firewall page. And now they're on to what's called the HMI, or the human-machine interface. This is the interface between authorized technicians and the operators sit on a daily basis, and this is where they make changes. And this is where they go through actual capacity to cause physical change in the environment, because that's what the corporate. But in this case, the technicians or the operators' credentials to be able to get into that system. So they're going to have all the same rights and all the same capabilities to be able to do what the technician does. But now we have someone, a different human, if you will, on the other end being able to. Let me show you an example. Bit by bit, out of the RDP cache, this is actually the threat actor having this level of understanding that when it's your ability to be able to make change. But again, the punchline of this entire story is they had the access but they didn't actually initiate changes. Again, but they don't do that. Okay, next slide. So that gets us through the story of how far they got and how they did it in this process. What are the recommendations? Well, if you're on the line, you haven't heard about it at all, I'm going to call the initial triage stage, and you're going, what should I do first? You want to go search indicators. Those indicators are located in that DHS alert, and you want to do so in the historical logs. And why do I say historical? Because, no surprise to anyone, when DHS and the other federal agencies came out and we started telling the world about how this was happening, the threat actor changed, and those logs as they come in. But if you can go back, there's a possibility there in that effort. Remain focused on the behaviors, the tactics, and the techniques. We've talked about a number of them here. There's a few more contained within the tech itself. This is not one where you want to become infatuated with a single key address or a single C2 server kind of mechanism, or just the subject line of the email. Those things are very, very fluid. This is one where you want the image file, the shortcut files with a external image source, etc. They say, we know we do business with, therefore we're going to trust them implicitly. This is usually not an immediate, right off the top of the bat kind of effort, but you find that this order comes down often to an IPT department out of frustration because some attachment gets blocked or some other reason. So you can review the actual technical implementation of the protections you have, the exceptions to the rules, and ensure that you have those properly scoped and that they all still apply. Continual monitoring, as you for those who have already looked for the initial indicators and are aware of campaign, but need to continue to be vigilant, continue to focus on those behavior-based analytics that I talked about just a minute ago. Staging targets, anticipate or watering hole, and those watering holes likely will be from organizations that you do business with, etc. And those are to the bullseye. Phishing as well. Look for C2s that are using legitimate credentials. Look for persistence through scripts, workstations, and so all of those efforts must fit many specific activities or had these implemented at the time the threat actor tried to attack. This campaign has been beyond this, and I find many organizations that go, well, of course not, and then they go back and check and they find the exception to them. This is one of those items that's one of the 2,000 items on the checklist that every IT security department should do. There's really not a good business justification for having external SMB outbound. It's just a matter of making sure you don't allow it. So go back and make sure that that's properly blocked on your network. Second of all, require multi-factor authentication for all external interfaces. And as I was saying earlier, don't just look at your main VPN and your main email access, but look at anything that's publicly facing, including things you may have out there with third party, and a significant effort we were application. We want to understand that if it's being overcome, or if they're using new tactics to be able to do more than just a simple username and password. What are they doing? How are they doing it? Understand that. Second of all, if you see any direct access or even just simply reconnaissance against your public information pertaining to control systems, please let us know. That is a very initial, early in the stage kind of warning sign that we can then engage with you and board in that effort. And finally, the non-interactive activities, or in other words, automated scriptings. In order to succeed and to scale an attack like this, you need to be able to automate efforts. And so we want to understand what that automation mechanisms look like. We want to understand what types of scripts and how they're running, where they're running, and if you see that type of behavior in that effort as well. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide, and this brings me to a conclusion of my discussion about the technical aspects in this. Thank you very much.
So before we begin our Q&A, a quick reminder that if you have a question for John, please type it in the designated Q&A polling box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can.
And I'm going to summarize all of these at once, talking about the how can I get more information, or if you're concerned about you potentially could be a victim in that regard. How do you do that? And the simple answer is to reach out to NCCIC, and we can be able to facilitate those. Be just a request for a personalized briefing. Okay, let me start down. A question was asked whether to be added to the TA 18074A Dragonfly report that was simply and currently has the release limit or any indicators of significance that are pending being continued to reference. Question was asked, will DHS be informing companies that may have been targeted? At this point, DHS has informed, DHS in conjunction with other federal agencies have informed the organizations that we know were on that effort. According to the slide deck and referencing there as well, to integrators, to research and R&D strategic partners, those types of categories, the category of vendor did not appear to be a critical decision in the selection to target and compromise the vendor network. It was much more about the pre-existing relationship that was known about in that effort. Okay, question was asked about how small are the organizations. Of the smaller organizations, again, down to just a couple dozen employees in that effort. No, it was noted there's a big difference between targeted versus compromised. Which was it? The answer being it's both. When we talk about hundreds of talking about targeted, we not comment on specific organizations, don't provide the identities of organizations that are compromised. We protect that information for the customer, for the victim, if you will, in that effort. I can tell you there are definitely quite a number that were compromised. The question was asked, did the vendor have a presence on the networks of the affected utilities? And the answer is in most cases no. There's not a direct link between them. There would not be some type of VPN tunnel or a dedicated pipe that goes between them. No authorized entry into. Although if you were targeted, the evidence you would see in your log file would be to appear to have a VPN tunnel coming from that trusted vendor using an employee's credentials. So there's a TTP that you can go search your logs for with that regard. But this is not a situation where a vendor went in or okay. Let me scroll through this. This box is really small for me to get through, so I apologize. I'm getting through all of this. With regards to the MS Word file, does the file make the call to the remote server if previewed in a File Explorer window? That's actually a fantastic question. I don't know the request for the normal .m file, and I believe this is me thinking through the process while I've got 1,000 people listening, right? And I believe that as long as it's displayed in the text-based format, the version is not as critical in that regard. Okay. There are a lot of questions. We're not going to get through all of these, but I will get through as many as possible. Not clear on how the ICS credentials are stolen. Simple explanation, a very long conversation. In many cases, the ICS credentials were the same or very similar to those that were on the local desktop situation processed as they're being entered on the where you would see some tools that were listed on that page, kind of things. Those things come in that realm as well. A comment was made that on one of the slides it says it would appear that requiring multi-factor authentication would have effectively mitigated. You were absolutely correct. Multi-factor authentication would go through that process. Let me scroll through here. The question was asked, any more information on how OWA was compromised or leveraged? Simple answer is, time do I have to work through a few questions here?
So we have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, question was asked, what is the thought of it for an organization that doesn't have data that goes that far back? Because I definitely reference the need for historical logs. That's not an uncommon question, not an uncommon problem to face. I guess so, and also look at the mitigations. If you're an organization and you do an analysis that says we have multi-factor authentication on all our external interfaces and have for situation, right? Regardless of that situation, look for those behaviors. So look for the SMB outbound. Look for the employee who lives in your hometown. So that's a tip-off that we need to go dig deeper and find out if there's something else. So look at that behavioral analysis effort. Okay. Question. I'm intentionally avoiding. There's a couple questions basically getting down to what the identity. The question was about customer service. That's NCCIC customer service at hq.dhs.gov. And that phone number is 1-888-282-0870. All right. Question was asked, was the exploit used for the initial compromise highly technical, like a zero-day or more publicly available exploit? The initial exploit used to be able to get into the networks was not a vulnerability at all. It was also required in that. The question was asked, where can our private partners go to receive information regarding cybersecurity? This is a chance for me to kind of foot stomp several different efforts, all of which we are presenters. We are actively involved in trying to get this information out. We do these public briefings. They're of importance to be able to ensure that you are and members of, and we constantly are doing two-way communication. That's not just a push out, but we're also asking questions, sharing that information before it goes public to be able to enable you to gain the upper hand, to be able to have it as early as possible in that cycle, and then the resources of if you feel like you're let's say in trouble, that you need more assistance, then please reach out to us. There are a lot more questions, but I feel like we're out of time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up from there. If you do have questions, please reach out to us. Let us know what we can do for you. It's been a pleasure to be able to present. Reggie, I'll kick it back over to you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, John, for that great Q&A. And I guess you covered your closing thoughts, so we appreciate that. So I'd like to thank Denise, John, and Jeanette for such an informative discussion. And to our supporters, thank you so much for tuning in. I highly encourage you to sign up for our alerts and updates so you can, again, that website is at the bottom, should be at the bottom right on your screen. For joining us with today's awareness webinar, and we hope to see you again on future webinars. And with that, operator, we have concluded.